Thank you.
Can people hear me? I don't know how I'll know if the answer is yes.
Yeah,
Cool. All right. Yeah, thanks for having us. It is true, Ami, you are a flexible, open-minded person. I wanted to congratulate you on this wonderful book, which you've been working on for as long as I've known you, actually. I think we're sort of legally obliged to begin by talking about the pandemic and coronavirus. It's been this time where we've had to reorient a lot of our lives and sort of think about rituals and rhythms anew. Can you talk a bit about your normal rituals as a writer and how they've either been disrupted or abetted by the current moment?
Sure.
All in capital letters.
First of all, well, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. This is like you're the first person not in my family that I'll be speaking with in about 2 weeks. The last time I was on a Zoom call, the person had never met me and they knew to make fun of the haircut I gave myself, which is why I look like this right now. So thank you for this opportunity to talk to someone.
Yeah. I mean, Ken Whisaker at Duke had arranged for us to have this conversation at the Graduate Center. And then, of course, the pandemic happened. And I'm very glad that McNally Jackson stepped in. So, John, thank you. In response to your question, for me, the best time to write is when the children have just boarded the school bus and I can come back, go up to my study and sit down with coffee. The children aren't doing that these days, So it has been a major disruption that way. But we have tried to enfold their schedules with ours and do stuff. And for me, it has been very creative, for example, to go to one site, which is a woman every day offering for free a drawing lesson to kids. So my son draws that, and I can also do a little drawing by the side, It's Wendy Mac at Instagram. She does an Insta live show. So what I'm trying to say is that writing should always be opportunistic, You little bit of a guerrilla warfare with time. So you snatch whenever you can ambush time, you ambush time. I still very much believe in the 20, 25-minute thing where you press the kitchen timer and just stick around for 10, 25 minutes. And that's what I've been doing whenever I can get it. And it's been great.
So, I was hoping that for the next 30 or so minutes, we could just talk about things like this. I mean, I've known you for quite a while, but I think I've never had a conversation with you about process, or at least one that I can remember the following day. And I think it would be interesting, I think for a lot of people, you should pick up the book. It is sort of like an index of all the interesting and exciting writers and thinkers of our time, all collected in about 180 pages. But, I was hoping we could spend this time to talk about things like this. So you're someone, I understand, who writes every day?
Yes.
How do you do that?
I carry a notebook with me all the time. So what that means is that you do not necessarily sit down and write for hours every day.
Okay.
But in my case, I must at least write 150 words every day.
Okay. Do you know when you've hit 150 words?
I'm always rather zealously counting them. But sometimes it doesn't matter because you have time and material. And so it goes on for a long time.
Okay.
But yes, and I think it's important from my position, it's really important to do these things every day. It's like you must train every day. I mean, an athlete doesn't say that I'll write, next week. They go every day, I think. I mean, I've never been an athlete, but that's what image I have in my head.
Ask your son. Your son is very prolific on the basketball court.
That's right.
So but what do you write? Say you wake up and you're like, I got to crank out 150 words. Do you write to a prompt? Do you just sort of write what's on your mind? And then do you ever revisit what you've written? Like, I know someone who's written in a journal for the past 18 years. He has never gone back to reread anything he has written.
No, I'm cannibalistic. In my real writing, I always use what I have written. And so I'm working on a project. It's not like general thoughts,
Okay, I see.
you know,
It's
like,
not Ami's musings, you know.
yeah. I mean, for
Okay.
example, right now, I'm very much interested. I've been interested for the past few years in the idea of fake news. Now, even during a pandemic, there is a lot of a generation of fake news. So I, when I wake up, I just scroll through the news and see what I can pick out, and then write it down, and that's how it accumulates. And I should tell our friends who are watching this that I use the desk that you gave me, Hua, and I'm not sitting there because my Wi-Fi doesn't reach that far, but that's where I sit down and do that piece of writing, and which I want to encourage everyone to do.
Yeah, obtain a desk from me, basically, is what you're saying. That is the secret to everything. Just a reminder that you can use the chat function, which is to my right, perhaps it's to your left, I don't know, to ask us questions. And in 25 minutes or so, we'll open it up to everyone. But you'd mentioned earlier that I see a thumbs up on the screen. I don't know where that came from.
It came from me.
This is very weird because I just see like two other people. You mentioned earlier that you're reading. What are you reading these days? And I'm also curious what kind of a reader you are. Are you a sort of monogamous reader? Do you have just like a dozen books laid out on your table? And as you're reading, what are you reading for? I ask in part because I think one of the reasons we're here is to talk a bit about the relationship between writing, questions of style, and academia. And I often find myself reading academic articles and being like ill-equipped to actually grapple with the ideas, but thinking about how I would rewrite them myself if I had this expertise. So I'm just wondering sort of what you're reading and sort of how you read and what you juggle as a reader.
In case there are young scholars listening to us, I just want to tell them that I think I wasted so many years of my life, especially as an assistant professor, reading all sort of shit, So I read these days.
We got through pretty fast. I was working my way there, but
no, man, I read only things that interest me, but also I read, for example, I have 6 books. I think of 6 to 10 books as my ideal companions for any project. So I choose that and I read between them. I go between them. So the other day I was writing a story, for example. So I had 5 or 6 books that I had got, and I would go back to them. These days during the pandemic, one thing which I had never had time to do, which I'm doing is, Yoon Lee is leading this community reading of War and Peace. And I'm a very impatient person, but I'm now about 1,000 pages into a book. I'm really, really proud of that. So that's something that is actually giving me a certain sort of a solid base these days. I do that as a daily activity too. I'm really interested in this, in promoting to anyone who's listening, this idea of dailiness, every day, how to read, how to practice meditation every day, or how to go for walks every day. Just do it every day. Make it a part of your daily life, and then that becomes your life.
I'm really intrigued by this thing you said about having like 6 to 10 books with you throughout a project. Is
Yes.
that how I understand this?
Yes.
Are these necessarily books that you consult to write the book, or are they just sort of companions? Like these are the kinds of books, or these are things that exercise certain muscles, even if they don't relate directly to what you're working on.
Yeah, they're companions. They also guide me or provoke me to think about style. And sometimes, and only sometimes, do they overlap also in subject matter.
I see. That's interesting.
So, for example, one of the things, a couple of the books that I promote in this book, I mean, there are so many examples of nonfiction that I advocate for, but let's say Claudia Rankine's Citizen.
Let's say.
I did have it on that shelf, I did have it on the shelf among those 6 to 10 books. Or I mentioned a book called Grief is the Thing with Feathers. Just for the formal experimentation and freedom that it delivers, a sort of a liberated voice exercising itself on the page. I loved that about that book. And so I kept it just as a reminder.
That's cool. I mean, I think that's definitely something that I will now steal. I mean, I just like the idea of there being a sort of kind of outer perimeter or outer boundary of where you want to go. And maybe these books contradict, but just hanging out with these 6 to 10 books may help you figure out or triangulate a new path forward. Because
Exactly.
I find myself to be a very unoriginal, so I'm often trying to just sort of mimic something. And having these contradictory things to mimic seems like something that could be really useful for me.
Yeah.
So a few minutes ago, you sort of ethered all of academic writing. I'm just curious, at what point you had this epiphany for yourself? I mean, I think obviously a lot of sort of railing against academic writing can easily slide toward a sort of anti-intellectuals of all
That's
these
right.
things. I think what you're interested in more is in style and persuasion or rhetoric. So I'm just curious how you began to feel this sense of this discontent, I guess, with certain styles of
Yeah.
academic writing.
Well, people like me get employed in the US Academy rather easily as post-colonial scholars. And that was my way in. That was my job in. But the quality of writing seemed, as it is, you're here as an immigrant, you're far away from people you know or can talk to. And then if the writing that you're doing seems all the more intransigently opaque, then that's an additional problem. I felt I was
Mm.
losing my readers all the time. And I did not entirely have faith in the folks who were supposed to be my mentors. Now, so that was where I started feeling like, oh my God, what use is this if no one is reading me? If
Mhm.
no one, for example, in India is reading me? So that's where the impulse came from. On this project, though, Ken, my editor, was good about saying, don't, I mean, don't be dismissive of everything that is interesting in academia. And I took that as a certain prod to think about, all right, what then are the books within, academia that I can find as give me some useful tips on how to do something that would be more attractive. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So can you talk about a couple of those books?
Well, when I was very young, not very young, but from this huge distance, even 30 seems like flowering of youth.
Yeah.
Um, but I read, for example, Manthya Devara's In Search of Africa.
So it's a
I thought,
really awesome book. I just read that 2 months ago.
yeah, I thought, my
Great.
God,
It's really
what
great.
and I remember, everyone today, for example, Saidiya Hartman is someone people have been reading a lot or know a lot about. But I remember at a conference, and I'm again talking about 25 years ago, going out after a panel with Saidiya and Manthya, and Saidiya saying, you know what I've learned from this book, Manthya? The importance of narrative, you know?
Hmm. Yeah.
And I thought, so I filed that away. So that book, or Rob Nixon, who had written a wonderful book on Naipaul, a critical study for his, which came out of his doctoral work, then wrote this memoir come cultural analysis called Dream Birds about ostriches. And the movement of that, those were a couple of books that were very, very exciting for me. Or Amitav Ghosh's In Search of an Antique Land. Or for that matter, Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickel and Dimed. I thought, my God, why don't dissertation advisors ever say to you, you know what, you could go and be a waiter, for I don't know, 6 weeks. And you could write that as your thesis. I wish someone had said that to me. I'd have loved that.
I mean, in their defense, there are certain fields where they do that. Perhaps not in the field I'm trained in, but
I know.
um,
You're right.
but I agree. I mean, I read In Search of Africa, Manthya Diora's book, fairly recently, just in trying to work out a project that I'm working on, and I was just struck by how every dissertation is a sort of in search of. There is a sort of quest narrative built into a lot of academic research, but we tend to not foreground that. I mean, maybe it would be sort of boring if it was always foregrounded, but there is a lot of narrative possibility there in talking about how you stumble upon a question, how you go about trying to figure out the answer to it. I mean, I don't even think that book really answers any of the questions it sets out to ask. But it's so interesting to kind of see the evolutionary turn in Diawara's thinking from the beginning when he's searching for his friend, and that's sort of what the book is about.
Yeah, yeah.
And then sort of his exploration of what like Africa represents to him. You've mentioned graduate school training and sort of the role that's played. You were in graduate school in the
50s?
I was going to say 60s, but in the 90s, right?
90s, yeah.
Okay, so when you were a graduate student, because I think a lot of graduate students were probably interested or might be interested in this book because it sort of calls into question a lot of sort of current academic training or the vestiges of it. What were you taught to think about writing or academic style or sort of the art of persuasion?
No. And that was one of the points of
Okay.
departure.
Uh-huh.
That was one of the points of, or entry, whatever you want to call it, for this book. I thought, why? I never did an MFA in creative writing, for example. But in creative writing, I could see from my friends, they were taught about writing all the time. But certainly in my cohort, and we did not have classes on writing. There might be something called methodology. I didn't have it, but I've heard in places where I've taught, graduate students are taught courses in method, but we didn't really have that. And so I was like, let me try to ask people the question, why do you think we don't have classes on writing? So that's the question I asked various creative writers. What do you think should be taught to grad students in, let's say, literary theory? Because I think that is indeed a part of what I'm trying to say in this course, in this book.
So can you talk a bit about how the book came about? I know you've been working on it for quite some time, and
Yeah,
I'm sure it's evolved quite a bit since when you first started doing interviews. But how did the idea of it come about, and how has it changed?
Oh, well, I had written a little article for a Minnesota Review issue where various critics were asked to declare their credos, And mine was a little, how shall I say, a little rant against post-colonial theory of a particular kind. And then at a conference, I had taken a printout of that, and I said to Ken Visaker, the editor at Duke, I said, Ken, let me ask some people, to supply such declarations of independence, freedom from academic writing. And Ken said, no, instead of asking all the different people, why don't you write it? Cool. So I began writing that. And then at one point, I don't know whether Ken remembers this, but Ken said, is this an attack on my list? And I was like, that gave me some food for thought. And then I wrote a few books in between, but I kept thinking about this. And then I would use certain style books in my own writing classes, like Stephen King or Annie Dillard. And I thought, how to give it more of an academic character. And that's how, the final plunge, that's what it was. How to produce a sort of a style book, but more for academic writers.
So how would you characterize what you think is, not to generalize, but what don't you like about academic writing as it's often practiced?
As it is often practiced, because, so it's a generalization, let's remember that, yes. I just don't like even being at conferences where everyone sounds the same. Is that a very, does that make me right now sound very cantankerous and shallow? Maybe, but
you're just a punk. That's it.
Yeah. I want style, and I want a certain sensitivity to language. People using the same dull vocabulary doesn't interest me much.
Isn't that vocabulary often necessary given what people are talking about? Everyone loves to shit on like neoliberalism as this term, but it's like, it really simplifies things if if people having a conversation about this thing
sure
on this term, right?
Yeah, I, by the way, would not oppose anyone who wanted to use the term neoliberalism. That's all right. Uh, I have a chapter here called anti jargon or something like that, if I remember right. Yeah, anti jargon. Is it necessary? I think often the debate about academic writing is reduced to for or against jargon. I don't think we should be narrowly interested in that issue. The thing is not simply jargon or not jargon.
Okay.
The thing really is, are you being are you paying as much attention to form? Are you paying attention to style? Are you producing writing that actually in some way mm, is attentive to, in the shape of its sentences, the very object you're writing about? That's, and are you aware of the reader? Are you aware of the other person? Or is it only being written for four people? I That's it. I mean, I wasn't saying there is one way of writing, but there are many ways of writing. And let
Yeah.
me talk about many ways of writing. Who are the people whose styles appeal to me for a variety of reasons? And I thought if I champion them with enough vigor, then especially young folk would be drawn to it and think, yeah, I want to do that. And that there is, and that some other people have got our back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I kept getting flashbacks as I was reading this to when I was in graduate school in the turn of the century, early 2000s. And at the time, it seemed as though, like non-academic writing was very much looked down upon, such that I I kept it hidden from my advisors and sort of my program. I mean, I don't think anything would have really happened to me, but just nobody really cared. Whereas nowadays, it seems as though it's being folded into the sort of expanding set of expectations we have for young scholars and sort of young people in general. Do you think that that's a concern? I mean, I think it's becoming the case, it seems, where graduate students aren't just expected to produce like rigorous scholarship, but also to write well and write beautifully and write for the public. Is there a problem there?
No problem there. I think it's because of your success, Hua, that people have started accepting that model. No, but really, it is true. It is true that when I was a younger person, you could not tell other colleagues to write in other forms or to write in other places because they would say always, "No, man, that will affect tenure." But I don't think that's so much of an anxiety right now. In that way, maybe various people could say that what I'm calling for has already become, in some ways, if not the norm, mm, it has become, people like Maggie Nelson's Argonauts is read by many
Very
people.
complex, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think, however, graduate students thinking about their projects necessarily think of as their first step, oh, how can I be inventive? They would like to be authoritative and thoughtful, which is great. But I have tried in some ways in this book to also debunk the claim to or the aspiration to authority. What does it mean to stumble through and express that stumbling in language?
Yeah. I mean, I go back to what you said a few minutes ago about how it's not that you're railing against a style, it's just that you're presenting many different styles.
That's right.
And it does seem as though what sort of dominates academic discourse is a sort of performance of authority that doesn't necessarily obtain in journalism or creative writing or essay or different kinds of essay writing. So I like the way the different voices in this book really kind of complicate your own presence as the author, but also sort of like the compiler of all these different views. Now, one thing that I thought was really funny there are a lot of funny things about this book, but one thing is you talk about the need to read bad writing.
Yes.
Can you talk a bit more about that? Because it's something that I think about a lot as well.
In its simplest form, if I'm writing a novel and I read a bad novel, it really, I'm sorry if this will sound very stupid, but it gives me hope. It's like, oh, this is such a shitty book. It got published. I think I could do a little better. Cool. Now, in terms of reading junk, I think it's an advice from Edward Albee. He says, if you only read the great writers, you'll be in trouble. Read junk. It's enormously encouraging to tell yourself, I can do better than that. I think that's great. And, W.G. Sebald's advice, which I quote, if you look carefully, you can find problems in all writers, and that should give you great hope.
Mhm.
Man, writing is an exercise in hope, how to go on doing it. And if reading junk gives you hope, I recommend it.
Yeah, no, I think that's really powerful advice. I mean, great writing can paralyze you, can inspire you, but writing that you don't think is great can remind you that you don't have to be that great.
Yeah.
You might as well write your own shitty book too, which is sort of how I often thought about things as I was working on my stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I might have quoted here, I can't quite remember, Danny Shapiro.
It's very negative advice, but
No. But, all advice that helps you write, we should grasp them,
mm-hmm.
even if it is negative. I mean, I think Danny Shapiro's quote might be here somewhere, where she says that a friend told her that she was going to go through the process of writing by having this little quote on a computer, which was, I'll just write my small bad book.
Mm-hmm.
So I just printed that in our office photostat machine, and I also stuck it on my computer, and I wrote a book. So I'm here as an advocate of any kind of help, any kind of advice that helps us get the job done.
I'm always curious, do you care how you come across in your writing? What someone might project onto your persona? I mean, I find your writing to be really kind of intimate and affectionate, but it's not necessarily some sort of transparent conveyance of like you into book form. Do you want to be perceived a certain way given your interest in style?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about, I don't know whether Ken Chen is listening to us, but this book is dedicated to Ken Visiker, Ken Chen, and my man Hisuk Chang. Ken Chen sent me on this mission where I would go to different bookstores, including McNally Jackson, and ask, excuse me, where is your white literature section? Now, I felt when I went again and again to different bookstores asking that question, I felt I was being a little bit of an asshole, because I was playing that naive immigrant going in and saying, where is your white literature section? And people looked at me, and sometimes they thought they should help me out, and sometimes they were naive and I think wrong in accepting my question on its own terms. But in writing about it, I just tried to be honest and express a certain discomfort with what I was doing. And therefore, I would say my attention to style, in my own case, is that people should get a complicated sense of honesty.
Mm.
Maybe you had done something, but you're being honest on the page. You might have lied, or you might have, engaged in a performance, but you're at least trying hard to be honest on the page. So that's my interest in style.
I love that. Yeah, that's literally a perfect answer to my question.
You're too sweet.
No, because I think that because I think that piece in particular, which was published at aaww.org, was one where it's not as though you were unafraid of sort of seeming like an asshole, but there was this sense of entering into the piece as this authority of a moment or of an experience, but then slowly disentangling that or giving it away. And I find that that's the kind of writing I like, is sort of writing that purports to be authoritative and then slowly kind of lets the reader in on some of that authority, and I think for me, writing is very much this management of authority. And so you have to figure out what you need to keep and what you can give away, and let the reader kind of see past you or see above your head.
Okay,
Um,
okay. So let me ask you then. Do you have examples of folks who are in academia who do that?
you're the one who has a book to sell, so I'll defer. I don't want to take up any time answering that question, but
Okay. You can write about it. Write about it in the New Yorker.
you know what? I actually have two books on my. I actually have some books on my desk that do this. That I have on. These are my 6 to 10 companion
Sure,
books.
sure, sure, sure.
One of them is Landscape
Wonderful
City
book.
Woman by
Yep.
Kay
Carolyn K.
Steedman.
Steadman.
Incredible book that's as much about kind of labor and gender history as it is this sort of penetrating memoir. And I really like the anthropologist Kathleen Stewart.
Yep.
And so I highly recommend these two books, Ordinary Affects and Space on the Side of the Road. They're sort of these, I don't know, they're memoiristic, but they're not really memoirs that allow you to gain any insight into this person per se, but they just force you to kind of think more deeply about the nature of encounters and experiences.
I advocate both those writers in my book, by the way.
You do. That's
Yeah.
why I felt safe bringing them up. Another question before we turn to other people's questions. Right now it's coming upon graduation season. Definitely the most memorable graduation season of my lifetime. I'm wondering what role, if any, teaching plays in sort of your life and your practice as a writer. Personally, I find it very difficult to write when I'm not teaching. And I find the two are weirdly in conversation with one another. Even if I'm not teaching things I'm writing about, I sort of need to have to explain things in order to then write. But I'm wondering if you see teaching as at odds with writing, or as something that helps that process along.
Earlier when I said that I wasted all my youth, I was thinking, for example, of all those years I was an assistant professor. I was given courses, and I never taught courses that were intimately related to what I was writing about. And now I only teach courses that have something to do with what I'm writing. So what I'm talking with my students about is a part of the conversation about writing. And often I'm inspiring them to write similar things, and they are inspiring me to be in conversation. So for me, it's vital.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that bothers me, though, is that I've never had the courage to just stop midway through class and read to them what I was writing, and thereby have a different sense of audience also, or an immediate sense of audience. And I think, I don't know about that. I'm doubtful
You
about
mean to have your students as the first readers for
it.
something?
Exactly.
Do you assign, this is a weird question, do you assign your own writing to your students?
Never. But I always think that they are presenting their writing. I'm
Yeah.
writing on the same damn thing.
Yeah.
I was teaching a course called Writing About the City, and I was writing about my hometown. So the book was coming along, and they were writing. And I think that if I had really a genuine sense of dialogue, maybe I'd be sharing my work too, which I've never done.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Now we're sort of nearing the general Q&A section, but are there any other questions you wanted me to ask you that I haven't asked you yet?
No. I'm totally cool.
I did have one. There was one thing that we thought about discussing, which is the role that editing plays in all of this.
Yes.
There's a really great section in the book about editing and sort of the role it plays, seeing it not as punitive or not as a form of discipline, but seeing it as a form of collaboration. Could you talk about that for a little bit?
The editing chapter has, I don't know, for those who can see, I don't know whether I can even see myself, but it is about a work of art by El Greco, and it was linked to a question that Garth Greenwell asked on Facebook or somewhere. He said that he pointed out to the fact that the painting is all askew. And he was wondering, his actual words were, wouldn't an editor want to make those less strange, to straighten those things out. And then he asks, and yet wasn't there strangeness the key to the greatness of the painting? I have to say, I have no idea sometimes. You know, I would like to ask you, how does the editing go at New Yorker, for example? But I sometimes think that what is strange in what I'm doing, let's say, if an editor says it isn't working, should I persist, and insist that no, it's all right, or should I just give way? I have no idea. So that's why I raised that question, and I'd like folks to engage with those chapters where a straight answer is not available.
Yeah.
But something to think about.
Yeah. I mean, it's something I think every writer, every thinker continues to struggle with sort of what becomes an impingement of your freedom. I mean, I guess that's what everyone is thinking about nowadays. But sort of what is tolerable, right, in terms of, and the degree to which your editor also sees this as a collaborative process. So
yes,
I think, but I think what's really important there, and perhaps something that is less evident nowadays because the publishing world has been so gutted, and there just aren't as many editors. There isn't that layer of editing that there once was. So I think it's important to have other people read your work and to talk about what works, what doesn't. And I think that's something that younger writers just don't have a chance to engage with as much. I mean, I don't think I really engaged with it until I was much older.
Yeah. Can I just make a quick comment?
Sure.
It'll
Please
take
do.
20 seconds. I want to very strongly advocate for collaboration, not just with editors, but with even the people who are right now in this conversation.
Yeah.
Who feel that you are, I mean, on one ground, simply as a result, if there's a chapter here called accountability that mentions these studies about what happens when you're just accountable to yourself, for example, and writing down what you have written that day. But what would it mean if you are in a group where you are accountable to someone else? It's a totally different game. And I want to encourage that very much. It's a different level of, so what I'm trying to say very quickly is that if we started this conversation by my saying something about writing daily, it's also do not write alone.
Mm-hmm.
Write with others. Be in conversation. Make collaborators of your friends and enemies.
Or with your former selves.
Right. So you wanted to address the questions. Is this your doing? Hua?
My favorite photos of you. Actually, though, before I share this screen, the book does end rather humorously with a recipe.
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk about that really briefly? Why you ended your portion of the book with a recipe? As I pour myself a drink.
Yes. I was talking about books should not simply be made of. Our books should not be made simply of words. We should have other things. We should have photographs, for example, but also dirt or string. To have this, because that's what comes from James A.G. And then I was thinking of asking people, what would you put in the book with your interviews, the people I talked to, including you, Hua? And then I thought, how about a recipe? So I put a recipe, for shrimp. But then, since I mentioned our friend Hisok Chang, I asked him the other day, what would you, what's your recipe for gin and tonic? And so he said, and I want to share with people, even if you don't need it, I'm sorry. Do you have their, Hua? I sent it to you a minute ago.
Yeah, I have it.
Can you read it out?
Gin and tonic is just gin and tonic, unless you make your tonic from scratch or do some kind of twist, which would defeat its elegance. Fill highball glass with ice, add 3 ounces of gin, 4 ounces of tonic, I like Fever Tree, squeeze of lime, stir and top with a wheel of lime.
That's it.
The most practical thing perhaps you learned during this.
Yeah, that's a practical advice. I love writing to be accompanied by practical advice, but also just how simple is that recipe? And still, that little flair, which would defeat its elegance,
Yeah.
that is style for me. So I'm glad that we're
Great.
talking about gin and tonic. I can almost taste the alcohol.
Okay. Great.
Okay, so
What's
what questions do we
what's
have?
what we aim for whenever I host an event. So let's turn to, there's some really wonderful audience questions. Um, do you have any? This is a question. Do you have any advice for academic scientific writing, where reviewers seem to be completely allergic to style? Plainer is better. How do you smuggle style into forms of writing that seem very averse to style?
Man, I, I, I don't want to sound nationalistic, but I think all the Indian doctors writing in the New Yorker have excellent writing style. Science there is really science writing there. And I mean, Siddhartha Mukherjee, Atul Gawande, all these folks are writing about science basically, but I think their style is amazing.
But
So I
how
would,
does it work? Is it sort of like a toggling between the particular and the universal? Is it storytelling? Is it sort of where the pieces start? Um, Maybe it's just all of these things.
all these things, come to think of it, all these things. I don't know whether folks watched, for example, the story of the gene that came out of Siddhartha Mukherjee's writing project. It's, this complex things, but such wonderful lucidity and a narrative tension being maintained. It's
Hmm.
amazing. But storytelling too. So
Yeah,
I don't have a very good answer for that, but that's what I immediately think of.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there are, as we were saying earlier, everything is sort of a search or a quest for something. And so if you could find that narrative, then even if it's laden in technical language, there should be ways to, at least tell a story.
Yeah.
I always think of writing as mostly boring sentences and just a few interesting ones, and that's sort of how rhythm is achieved. So maybe that's another
Well,
way of thinking
well,
about
well,
it.
in my case, I want to say to people who are listening that in your case, while retaining a certain clarity, your first paragraphs and the last paragraphs are just so full of, where you're doing the dance that I always wait for that. That's where you pick up, and you do a little spin that makes you think, there's all this clarity, but there's also this other thing happening.
Yeah, just read the first and last. It's all you need.
That's what I'm saying. But anyway.
Okay, another question. Akil Sharma says 80% of writing is just managing your mind. Do you agree?
Managing your mind.
Mm-hmm.
What is the quote again? 80% is
80% of writing is just managing your mind.
managing your mind. No, man, I think it's managing time. 95% of writing is just managing time. Are you finding time, in my case, are you finding time every day to put your ass down in the seat and write? To have a certain sense of focus, to have your influences lined up on your bookshelf, and to persist with it,
Do you find yourself to be a better writer daytime, morning, nighttime?
Ah, these are personal questions in the sense that for everyone it will. I don't mean that they're intrusive questions. I mean personal in the sense everyone has to find their time. Toni Morrison's great advice is find your time and stick to it every day. She didn't want you to do what I was saying. The opportunistic ambushing of time. She
Mm-hmm.
wanted you to get up and write at that same time every day. In her case, it was the dawn.
Mm-hmm.
So choose your time and stick to it.
So avid fans of your entire oeuvre, not just of your writing, know that you're also a bit of an outsider artist, one might say. You dabble in watercolors and other forms of visual arts. Can you tell us, Professor Kumar, about how your visual arts practice has influenced your writing life or your thoughts about style? Joni Mitchell calls it crop rotation, moving between her painting practice and her songwriting. What's it like for you?
Ah, I had been, for those who have read, I have always been thinking about photographs as a part of writing, and then thinking about photographs as being a little bit more opaque or something that allows you to complicate the writing, something that's takes away the transparency and makes people more thoughtful about what you're saying. So that purpose now, I have tried to switch from photographs to painting.
Mm-hmm.
And the particular thing I've been doing these days is where I take something from the news and then paint so that you can slow the news down, or to use a pretentious phrase from Jimmy Fallon, how to slow jam the news. That's what
And
I'm doing.
pretentious?
I mean, I'm sounding pretentious if I just follow that. Say, I'm trying to slow jam the news.
How did you arrive at the form of Every Day I Write the Book? When did you feel the content had found its shape and its skin? Because if you go back and read the credo from the Minnesota Review,
That's right. That's right.
It's very different. It's much more polemical and almost very straightforward. Whereas this is, even though this is you, there are so many other voices. It's sort of like you're conducting a symphony or something, a very discordant one. But when did you feel like it had found its proper shape?
I thought I might have been helped. I'm sure if Ken Vesiker is here, I mean, he would say we got some folks to read and respond to it too. But really, all books, it's in the process of writing them that you find some form. And in my case, I thought something that was loose and moved in different directions would be the best sort of a guide, so that you could slip into it when you needed something to motivate you to write and move you in different directions, and then you could follow that. So I can't quite pin it down to a moment or something.
Can you talk about how you pick the writers you discuss and praise in the book?
Only my friends.
There's nobody in the book you actually don't like?
Well, a couple of people are dead, so I couldn't talk to them. For example, Sven Lundquist. I don't know whether he's alive or dead. I mean, I don't know him. I was struck by the quality of his book. The structure was amazing.
What book and what made it amazing?
On Bombing. Have you read it? On Bombing. Sven Lundquist. You can open that book on any page, and you can start from there. It's amazing. But mostly just the books that I came across, and then my editor helped me. He would suggest some names. That's how I discovered Ordinary Affects. Claudia Rankine, because I read, before the book came out, I had read a short prose piece, and it was actually a prose poem, and it was actually about academia. And I thought, this is someone I want to pay particular attention to for this project, And then from then I began reading everything she was writing, and then that's how it grew. I mean, that's what happens. And that's wonderful about academic writing. It takes time. You're able to focus on something, and over time, you're able to incorporate all sorts of things and make changes.
Yeah. I actually think that that's one of the beautiful things about academic writing and research, about
academic work,
that people don't capitalize on enough, which is that if it's sort of specialized to begin with, you should feel actually liberated to take stylistic chances or to experiment. This is a really interesting question, and I think it's sort of the age-old question as well. How does one develop one's own way of writing? I ask because I find myself drawn to the writing I like to the extent of mimicking or parodying, or if I may confess, plagiarizing as a way forward. So it's sort of like, how do you develop your own style, but also what role does mimicry, plagiarism, sort of trying on someone else's skin in a way, what play in that process?
I think a lot of plagiarism happens in academia. People often invoke the same names over and over again. That's, for me, is a form of plagiarism. You couldn't go to a conference and not hear the same authorities being invoked. But really, there's a lovely interview that Rob Nixon has in that book, in my book, where he says, I asked my students to develop their voices rather than their voice.
Mm.
So how to think of someone who is thinking about various folks he or she wants to plagiarize or just mimic. Think about how you are not tied to any one of them, but you're tied to several. For example, for me, John Berger is an important influence. But John Berger, as a leftist writer, is very different from a somewhat reactionary, sometimes writer like V.S. Naipaul, who is very different from someone like Arundhati Roy, whom I also admire immensely. But for me, all those voices deserve a place on the page for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mind moving between them, And that's what I would recommend to the others. And also it comes across, doesn't it happen through time, across, you struggle with it through time. I mean, people should not worry about these questions, frankly, also. You know what I'm saying?
Wait, what do you mean?
In other words, not think too much or worry too much that, oh, I'm plagiarizing, oh, I'm mimicking. I mean, that's what I feel. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
if my students in my classes raise an issue like that, or they'll say, do you think it is ethical to talk to this person? I'm always like, why don't you talk to the person? And why don't you express on the page this question about your inhibition but go ahead and do it. In other words, don't be inhibited about pursuing the writing. Pursue the questions that you're asking about it in the writing itself rather than anterior to it.
Yeah, makes sense. And I agree. I mean, I think that I often encourage my students to not to plagiarize, but to try on different styles.
Oh, of course.
Very extreme differences, just because, you might not like how it fits, right? You might not actually feel that that's your energy or your rhythm. Can you leave us with any writing exercises or anything that you tell your students to do that seem particularly useful? I mean, I think a lot of us have a lot of time nowadays, so.
The other day, I watched a little video of Jenny Egan, who during this pandemic for PEN America just read out a few words. And she wanted us to write down whatever was the association. I don't know whether people can see, but here, I did something like that with her. If you asked me, I would say to people, because of what we were just talking about, why don't you think about, and this is all, again, close to an advice that is offered in this book, why don't you think about one page of any writer, I don't know, Eve Sedgwick, that you like, and then another writer who can remain unnamed, who you don't like, and then write a page. That's a writing exercise, and think that is what you're going to, do tomorrow or the day after. How do you write in a way that you like? And sometimes then how do you write in a way of someone you don't like? And then it'll just make you more conscious of your own, of your own proclivities.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I could, I just want to say to everyone, I can't say, but just want to say hi. Is there a way I can later on know who all are here and all that?
Yeah, people can, everybody can say hi if they want to unmute themselves and say hi.
Hello, everybody. Oh, I see now. I see. There's some more students here. Wonderful to see your names and friends and colleagues.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you for all the writing.
And everybody for
Kevin.
Hey, Kevin.
Yes.
I think that might be all we have time for, but Amitava, I'm so glad we could do this. And Juan,
Thank you
for moderating, and thank you for
having us.
Zoom backgrounds. And
that's Hua's work.
If you can get the book from us online, we'll ship it straight to your home. We hope you'll support Amitava and McNally Jackson at this time, and keep an eye on the site, see who else we're bringing to your screens. But I'm just so glad we could do this. This was a lot of fun.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thanks
All
to
right,
everyone for
buddy.
coming.
Yeah.